All right. Well, welcome to the Biblical Lens podcast. I want to get Brad up here, our founder and president. I'm excited for this. We did this on my channel, Renovating Faith. Oh, gosh. How long?
A while back.
It was a while back, and had a really, really good response. Everybody seemed to love it. And so we decided, well, let's continue the conversation, and we were going to schedule a part 2. And then you guys invited me to be a part of Alternate Media. And we said, well, why don't we just turn it into a show? Because we need content. And we had a great time with it. And so we've been trying to get this set up and figured out the right timing and everything. But before we go any further, we do have a special message from our vice president.
Oh, and don't forget to bless that like button and believe in the subscribe button.
So you heard it right there. Hit that like button. And then, of course, if you haven't visited the new Alternate Media shop, make sure you go by and you can pick up Biblical Lens merchandise. Not this particular mug because I'm very disappointed in it, but I figured I should at least rep a little bit of the merch. Get one of the better mugs. This one was very sad. Sorry. We should probably just bring up the other hosts.
Let's bring up our guests.
All right, returning after our wonderful conversation, bring back Mr. Joshua Sherman. So, Joshua, how you doing tonight?
I'm doing pretty well. Glad to be here.
Good. I am excited. I know this is a topic you really, really love. We were going to do this on Easter, and it wasn't going to work. We had Passover happening. We had the Orthodox.
It would have been too perfect.
You're right.
Yeah.
It really would have. And then, unfortunately, Will Hess decided to put work before friendship. And I told him I was going to throw him under the bus. I was like, I see how it is. You're going to be a Baptist about this. I say that.
He's on a mission trip right now, isn't he?
He is on a mission trip.
And so you're just driving the bus thump right over him? Okay.
Yeah, pretty much. But it's hard to do that in Nashville right now because never mind. That was dark. I'm sorry. All right.
Yeah.
So in lieu of Will, we have our producer, Mr. Austin James, joining us tonight, also known, you took it down, also known as the whiteboard guy, if you're on TikTok. So Austin, thank you for stepping in, and it was actually on pretty short notice, so I'm excited about
unlike
tonight.
Will, I have my priorities straight, so
This
that's
is
why I'm
true.
here.
This is true.
I've got Will represented. I mean, the book is represented. So
I had to just joke about what would happen if the symbolism of that book falling on Brad's head, but yeah.
Right. That's why I put the holy water next to it.
Holding it up there?
Right. Yeah. It's warding off the evil spirits.
Thank you, Will Walkie, for that amazing suggestion to all of our fans. And in the spirit, I do actually have Will's book here as well, because if you're going to talk about the Atonement, I really do think this is an incredible resource. Brad, I believe you helped contribute to that in a lot of ways.
A little bit.
You had a lot of talk. Sherman, I know you were on the actual writing panel in parts of it. I was allowed to be on the writing panel, but I stayed out of it because I told him someone needs to actually take charge of reading this thing when you guys are done and having fresh eyes. So I stayed out of that until it was time to do the review. Nice. But I absolutely love it. Of course, one of my favorite Christian authors is C.S. Lewis. And I told Will, I said, this feels like a C.S. Lewis quality simplicity, but you don't shy away from depth at the same time. It's very, very readable. So I highly recommend it if you want to know a lot more about the Atonement, different theories, and particularly why a certain one that we're going to talk about tonight is wrong. Go read Crushing the Great Serpent by Will Hess.
That does seem to be a point of common ground between us tonight.
Right? It really does. All right, gentlemen. Well, without further ado, so I'll let y'all kind of monitor comments, and I'm going to pull some of these up. Let's talk about atonement theories. So we'll get into some nitpicky on some of this, but the big question that's hitting the church right now is, what did Jesus do on the cross? Aside from the obvious, he died. What was the point of it all? And so there's a large group of theologians, and some people have been kicked out of groups for not holding to a certain view, that hold to a very, we'll just throw it up there. All right. So PSA, let's just define it. And I'm going to caveat this, because if Jordan Ferrier watches this video later, and I don't say this He'll come after me. When we say PSA, what we're going to define is actually called vicarious penal substitutionary atonement, or VPSA, because there are, as we found out through some other debates, there are like 5 different variations of PSA. Well, people, well, I don't actually have to believe that. Okay. If you ask the average Christian, specifically who comes from Reformed thinking, what is penal substitutionary atonement? What they will define is vicarious penal substitutionary atonement.
Mm-hmm.
And so substitutionary atonement in its basic is that Christ took our place. The penal part says that he paid the penalty for us. The vicarious part is this whole, well, he died a sinner's death and the wrath of God was poured out on him and God forsook Jesus and all of that other entailment. So anybody want to add anything to that definition?
I think one of the parts of it that I would take it much more seriously if this were explained from it. It focuses so much on his death and not enough on the fact that he lived.
Yeah,
everybody forgets, like the substitutionary atonements, especially penal substitutionary atonement, is very, very based on payment for what Adam started, right? It's very inherently tied to original sin.
Yeah.
Okay. But the punishment for Adam's sin was not just death. It was that he had to live here rather than the garden. He had to experience a full life here where he would also experience death, rather than in paradise.
Well,
so if that were brought up, if it were acknowledged that actually part of the punishment, so to speak, that was being experienced was just the fact that he had to live here.
Yeah.
I might take it just a little more seriously.
Well, and let's also not forget the redundancy that a sinner's death is because of sin.
Mm-hmm.
There is no such thing as a sinner's death. Like
all death is a sinner's death.
All death is sinner's death. The fact that Christ died is a sinner's death. So that's a big redundancy.
That's a huge one.
And the fact that, to say that Christ died a sinner's death in our place, well, how come no one from Adam until the Romans was crucified?
Well,
until that was,
even with that, like, and this is, it's not TikTok, so I can say whatever I want. So sorry, buckle in. So one of the things is, like, if PSA was a thing, then prior to Jesus, assuming that all that you needed was this like innocent person to die on behalf of someone else, then by that logic, prior to Jesus or even modern day, you should be praising every abortionist or whoever, because anyone who murders an innocent who has never sinned, oh, congratulations, he's paving the way for you right now. That person's like taking care of additional sins or whatever else. Because at the end of the day, it's not just being blameless. Like, you're not, if God is Molech, then maybe this is the case. But we're not looking at a God who's waiting for someone to be like born pure and then be like, oh, I've just been waiting, like animals and stuff. That wasn't good enough. What I really wanted was like this perfect virgin human that was blameless. And I wanted him to slaughter. That's the only way to appease my wrath. And that's the only way for me to take out all my vengeance.
Well, and that's also
and
where,
he's canceled.
like,
We're done.
That's also where
that was nicely done for effect.
The original sin comes in, right? That's where a lot of people actually. I have yet to meet somebody who does subscribe to PSA that does not also subscribe to original sin. I'm sure there might be some out there, but I really haven't met any. And that is where they would disagree with the point that you just gave, Austin, is because they're like, well, no, because those babies in the womb were still stained by sin because original sin.
Right.
There is no true innocent person, regardless of what they have done.
But even that gets tangled into this whole web of, like, well, one, what is original sin and how do you catch it, right? Because if you go into the how did I get infected with original sin, then it ends up at the end of the day, it ends up being, well, you have the ability to be tempted, and that's the thing that makes you sinful by nature.
It's sinful semen.
Right. But
yeah,
at the end of the day,
my
that's
smirk
what it is,
there
right?
was the meme version of Augustine's. Yeah.
But like, if it's that, then you end up with some issues, because on one hand, it's either it only passes down through the father, but if it's only passing down through the father, Mary is still made from father's seed, and so at which point do you have to go back?
That's where we need the Immaculate Conception, according to
But
the
then
Roman Catholic Church.
Immaculate Conception, you have to go back before that, because where did she get the Immaculate, and why not
Yeah.
Jesus just be Immaculate? And then if you say, oh, it's only temptation and it's the inherent nature to sin, well, then it says Jesus was tempted in every way that we are. If he wasn't tempted in every way we are, then it wouldn't have said that. So clearly he had the struggle with temptation. And anytime that you talk to anyone who's common in Trinitarian debates and things is, well, he had a human nature. This is his human nature talking. This is the desires of the flesh that are talking right now. So you can't separate the two and say, oh, well, he didn't have this aspect of this one thing that defines what that aspect is. So it's either he had original sin by that same definition, or he didn't, but you have to define both terms. And that's generally, most of theology is just missing what is the definition of our terms. Because if you actually were to define it, you would have better theology.
Well, and we're going to get into the definition of atonement a bit later on too, but yeah, I don't want to jump that too early.
Yeah.
One of the things you said, Jeremy, when you introduced this topic, you introduced it essentially as asking the question of what did Jesus accomplish on the cross, and I would like to blow that up with a big bomb, because I don't think we can contain what he accomplished to what he did on the cross.
That's true.
So you have Paul saying that he was raised for our justification in Romans 4. You have Hebrews 9 describing essentially what I think is most consistently understood to be his post-resurrection, post-ascension offering in the heavenly tabernacle as our great high priest in Hebrews 9. So there's a lot of these other things that you go on there and you start to realize, like, actually it's a question of what did he accomplish throughout his entire life, in his death, in his resurrection, in his ascension, in his high priestly work, and what is he accomplishing now? Yeah. Right? Seated at the right hand of the Father, continuing to intercede for us. Like, all of that, to me, if your definition of atonement is what has Jesus done that is bringing us back into reconciliation with God, which is the broader version people usually mean when they say that term, then all of that is in view.
Yep.
That's part of the conversation we have to have, is defining those terms. So we'll get there.
Yep. No, I completely agree. That was something Paul Vanderdy pointed out on Idol Killer's PSA stream, where they were responding to Mike Winger, is we can't take that out. Hundreds of people died on the cross. Hundreds of people died various ways in similarities to Jesus. Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15 that it's the resurrection that is our hope, right? We can't take that out, and we're going to get into a couple other theories too that really do focus on his life, and I love that you brought that up, because you're 100% right. It's more than just what he did in his death. It's the example he set for us to live. It's let's just bring it up really quick. It's the moral influence aspect. The fact that his teachings, his way of life, the things he did, the way he walked and carried himself, the halakha that he practiced was designed to show us the right way to go about living and to influence us positively, morally, and to cause us to live a similar lifestyle.
Yes.
To love your neighbor as yourself, to love God with everything you are in the way that he did. And of course, that's part of why I'm in the journey that I'm on, thanks to Brad and Austin. And
so I have a question with some of these atonement theories. I'll just put it out there. Did Jesus have to resurrect for any of these atonement theories?
Yes.
Yeah, I would dare say for most of them. Actually, I think so. I would think the better question is: are there any atonement theories that are not contingent on the resurrection?
Well, yeah. Actually, I would say PSA is not.
I hadn't thought about that. Yeah, you're right.
That one, usually what they'll say is that his being raised is simply a vindication that his penal substitutionary death atoned for us.
Yeah.
And that's about all that they drop in that bucket.
Moral influence, I would say, is probably not.
Yeah, that one's interesting.
Moral influence
is more about his life.
Yeah, moral influence wouldn't necessarily, the resurrection would bring about a higher awareness, because it's the idea of change. So Correct. You're putting your hope in that resurrection. So that follows more suit with Moed Katan 28a, which is the death of the righteous atones for the many. But the only way that that death atones for many is if you are to look at that death and then that actually changes how you live. If it hasn't changed how you live, then it doesn't actually atone for anything.
Yep.
And that's interesting because that actually has some crossover even with scapegoat theory and Gerard, because he talks a lot about the unmasking of evil at the cross, but there is also the aspect of the displaying of the truest icon of God.
Yeah.
Right. That you have Christ on the cross displaying who God is in self-giving, and that becomes a big thing about, how do we understand how we are supposed to live too? Yeah. If we're supposed to live cruciform lives, if we're supposed to have the same kind of self-giving love, how do you demonstrate that if it's just the death and then nothing else happens? You can demonstrate it, but people probably aren't going to care as much. Right. Yeah. And so you're right that the resurrection draws our eyes to that. And I think that has interesting aspects too of what does it mean to look upon the truest representation of the true God in that self-giving love versus looking at idols of false gods.
Yeah.
And how does that bring about essentially the end of paganism, broadly speaking, over centuries? I think a lot of that is just like, you look at this and this is compelling. This just crumbles in comparison.
Yeah. So PSA is one of the largest in Protestant theology. The next two, I would say, do actually rely heavily on the resurrection. The first one is one of my favorites, and that is ransom theory. So Christ paid the ransom. So Scripture says that we owe a debt. Kind of very C.S. Lewis, Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, right? For every treachery, the witch is owed a debt. Aslan pays that debt, but then comes and turns those tables, which ties, it's kind of a give and take or tie into the other one, which is Christus Victor. So Christ the Conqueror. Now, I know Sherman's got quite a bit for us on this, so I don't want to steal his thunder. So I'm going to give the basics of this, and that is that Christ conquered death. Death was reigning. Christ conquers death and provides life for us. And it's very similar to ransom theory. So, Sherman.
Yeah.
Tell me where I'm wrong.
Well, so if you want to tie into a little bit of biblical background for what you described there as kind of a mere Christus Victor, I would say, I think there's more to it, but you have Hebrews 2:14 and 15 that Jesus became human in order to redeem human beings, and part of how he does that is through conquering death through the power of death and taking the power of death from the devil, right? You also have Revelation 1:17-18 where he talks about being I'm the living one, I was dead, now I'm alive, and I hold the keys of death and Hades. Well, how does he get those keys, right? It's like, oh, that seems like there's conquering involved there. The other thing that gets really interesting with ransom theory is if you start to ask the questions of who got paid.
Yep.
And then if you back up a step, it's also, was it even a payment? Yep. Right. And this is where I think you could actually tie together Christus Victor ransom, and we're later going to talk a little bit about Passover all together in a way. If you look at it and say, well, the term used for ransom in the New Testament is also used in the Septuagint for God ransoming his people from Egypt, which he does by defeating the gods of Egypt. That's not really a payment. Yeah. Right. And so then you start to have all of these big questions come up.
So interesting about that, the part of, at least I would say maybe at least a small aspect of where ransom theory can fit into the Exodus narrative. And it's interesting how, like, depending on which part of the Old Testament we look at, there seem to be some representation on some level of multiple of these theories. And one thing we can derive from the Torah regarding ransom theory would actually be the death of the firstborn of Egypt, which was still a conquering in total of the gods of Egypt. But this is why God, even in the Old Testament, demands that the firstborn of your household, to even include animals, be redeemed by you. You have to redeem it from God because it belongs to God first, as kind of a stand-in for the firstborn of Egypt that he had to kill. You know, the idea is like, look, that was the cost, that was the price for your liberty, was the firstborn of Egypt. And so now you owe me your firstborn, and you must redeem them back from me.
Yeah. Which just kind of, if you try to make that into an analogy for the payment being the penalty in a PSA framework, I don't know how you make sense of any of that.
I don't
Right.
I don't think it can fit in PSA.
Right. Yeah, which is one of the reasons why I don't think it works is
Yeah.
the more of the biblical language and concepts and analogies and stories and narrative and everything you could possibly throw at it that you start to look at when you look at this topic. I feel like it reminds me of that video of the guy that's like, and this block goes in the square hole, and the lady's just like, no, and that's how I feel. I'm that lady when I see people trying to just make everything into PSA, and I'm just like, it's not okay.
That was amazing.
What would be the strongest case for PSA? Because I can think of 1,000 ways to dismantle it, but when it comes to like if there was one thing that's like, man,
let me just, and this is going to be minorly insulting, I think, but I think that PSA essentially derives from a gross misunderstanding of the sacrificial system in general.
Yes.
Right. And so because they don't understand how the sacrificial system worked, even going as far as Cain and Abel, they don't understand what that entire system was all about, or why it was in place, or what it was for. And so because of that, it's the most bare bones basic idea that maybe a child could think of what's happening there, of what's transpiring.
I think probably the strongest case that's going to convince people is reading something like Isaiah 53 just on the face and not having a larger sense of the context of what Isaiah is talking about, not having a good sense of the background of sacrifice, not having a good background of kind of how this has been understood. Obviously in any of your rabbinic commentaries, like all of the things, the more that you stack up context with that text, the harder it gets to then look at it and say, plain reading, this must be what this means.
PSA is the perfect model for quick conversions.
Yes. I would dare say that it's like, if we could equate it to a political ideology, it is communism. You know, it's like I said earlier, it's the child's answer to a problem, right? It's something that you could explain to a child in very simple terms very quickly. You could explain PSA to a child in 5 minutes, and they would understand it and comprehend it, and it would generate some kind of guilt that would bring them to a sense of repentance, but more so fear-based than anything.
Yes.
Very. Well, and hopefully in understanding it, they would also have some sense of like, how does punishing the innocent fix this? You know, how do we transfer guilt? Like those kinds of questions that then.
But they typically don't, because here's what, especially with kids, what they hear is, I did something bad, I have to be punished. Jesus loved me enough that he took the punishment for me.
Yep.
Now I don't. Now, if I choose to reject that, I still have to go to hell. Scary bad. If I accept it, I'm saved.
Mm-hmm.
Jesus is great. God the Father.
Fire insurance.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And so that's really
why
it's very good for quick conversions. It's highly backed by pagan ideas and Greek philosophies. And
I would dare say, and Joshua, I'd love to know your thoughts on this, because, you know, us here, you know, being from the Torah observant camp, and you being from the Orthodox camp, where your deeds actually do still play a heavy part in your faith walk. I would dare say that PSA is almost a foundational basis for effortless grace.
Yeah.
You know, for cheap grace.
Yeah. I mean, if the penalty has been, and this, I actually, personally, I think that the way that Calvin put together his own particular view of this was essentially an escape hatch from the Roman Catholic sacramental system. So instead of yes, you have to go to confession, you need to do penance, you need to partake of the Eucharist, you need to do these things. Now you don't have to do any of that because Jesus paid the full price, and there's nothing that those Roman Catholic priests can give you that you can't get by coming and partaking of the word and sacrament in my church, right? That is essentially the logic that he seems to have followed in creating a system around this. I mean, honestly, Austin, I struggle to steelman this anymore, because every time I start to go in to do it, I end up running into, I can't say that because that's not what that word means. I'm not going to say that because that's not what that passage is talking about. I'm not going to say that because that misunderstands sacrifice. And it misunderstands, like, probably one of the most eye-opening things for me was reading a book by Father Jeremy Davis, who's an Eastern Orthodox priest, called Welcoming Gifts. And he talks about sacrifice and all of these things. And one of the things that he did is he basically just kind of walked you through, like, this is how pagans understood sacrifice, right? And when you read that, you realize, actually, in a lot of ways, pagans had a better view of sacrifice than people that think PSA is the only way to understand sacrifice. Because they actually had a sense of, we are coming together as a community, we are celebrating something, we are doing this, and it's meant to be communion between us and our gods. And yes, within that system, they had an understanding that sometimes the gods were mad and you had to appease them. And you had people abuse it and try to bribe the gods, which should sound familiar if we read the Old Testament and how God responded to sacrifices that were basically bribes from Israel. And he said, no, right? So when you realize that their system actually had a sense of sacrifice that had, I would call it, if you took the whole, like, my God as a demon part out of it, a healthier view of sacrifice that then has the unhealthy within it. And it's like PSA advocates have taken the most unhealthy part of the pagan system, centered it, and then and they're so blind to everything else they can't even see that, like, a lot of sacrifice is about communion and community and fellowship and relationship and like, that just blew my mind when I hit that, because I was just like, oh, like, you're missing all of this stuff, not only that pagans understood, but also with the right God in the right communion. Like, it hurt me almost to read that and realize what was going on with people that are advocating for this.
One of the interesting aspects about that, just the pagan idea of sacrifice, and I don't know how accurate it is. I would have to ask some of my Norse pagan friends who've actually done the research. But the show Vikings actually exhibits some of the sacrificial process of that era. Now, again, how much Hollywood played a role in affecting that, I don't know. But one of the things I found fascinating about it is the sense of community that they invested into that process, in that they didn't just handpick, at random, a victim for the sacrifice. Anybody who was going to be their human sacrifice had to be willing. They had to volunteer for it. As part of a way that they could give to the community.
That's interesting. I mean, so a lot of what we understand about that is really hard to get to, because you end up getting into, the only records we have of some of those things are from Christians that later wrote things down about them. And so then you're like, okay, what impression did they have of that? How much did they kind of Christianize it? Like, how much did they polemicize again? So it does get a little bit hard to read some of that stuff and really get an accurate view, which gets to be interesting, because then you essentially, like, a lot of people that are neo-pagans, they're kind of LARPing, because they don't really know.
Right,
like,
because everything that we do, like you said, everything that we know is based on what the Christians wrote about them.
Which is, that definitely gets interesting.
Austin, do you happen to know this reference that Aaron posted?
Yoma 39A. I don't. I can pull it up though.
I'm gonna see what he's tying in here real quick.
Aria for the win.
Right.
There we go. But I mean, that whole idea of what Atonement is trying to deal with is enabling proper communion and community between people and deity. And, in our context, between a very particular deity who is the creator, like, that is a much broader frame than just looking at it and saying, like, something's got to die. Right. And you can actually see that in a number of places in the Hebrew scriptures where, okay, what can make atonement? Sometimes you get people that will read Hebrews and they'll say, well, blood is required, so that has to be there all the time. But then you start reading it and you go, okay, they must have been talking about something very specific, because I see a lot of places where blood is not required for atonement, right? So you have gifts of money, you have mediation, you have mercy and truth, you have repentance, you have burning flour, you have elimination rites, you have incense, you have holiness contagion, you have death without blood, you have time and or judgment. All of these things can make atonement.
Well, and interesting about that, and this is something me and my dad have talked about at length, is the idea that is conjured when we talk about the issue of blood itself involved in sacrifice, is that generally speaking, the average Christian who subscribes to PSA actually they think about blood in a very pagan way. It's not something that's Semitic, and it's not something that really is supported by the biblical text. I mean, they view blood as representative and inherently tied to the death process.
Yep.
That's not the case, right? Well, everything that we read in the Bible regarding blood is that it's life, right? Because the life is in the blood. So blood is representative of the life, not even just representative, but quite literally so. And so for Yeshua in particular is where, again, I think it's too belittling to focus so much inherently just on the death aspect.
Yep.
Because when
Absolutely.
we talk about his blood shed, what are we really talking about? What was his life made of? Well, his life was made of everything that he did in his life.
The miracles, the teachings.
Yeah. Well, and you want to talk about the miracles in Isaiah 53, right? Part of how the gospel authors understood the fulfillment of Isaiah 53 was him taking upon himself our diseases and these other things. And they tie that to his healing ministry.
Yep.
So again, it's like, oh, if my only thought about Isaiah 53 is, servant needs to die, therefore we can go for, like, there's just so many things that it's like, at least there's more going on. And then the more you dig, you can start to say, well, is the thing I have in my head even part of the equation? The challenge with PSA is that a lot of people will say, this is the only atonement theory that has any mechanism that can make this happen. And I just think that's the wrong way to look at it. But I also think they have a very narrow idea of what mechanisms are and how that works. And frankly, if you're thinking mechanism, when you think about these kinds of things, you're probably actually thinking more about magic than you are the way that scripture talks about atonement. Because, the priest can do all the things they do. If you bring the sacrifice without, and you don't bring it with the right heart, like, God doesn't want it.
Yeah.
And the prophets say that over and over and over and over again,
It's interesting because even that understanding actually would still pull the entire process into general magical theory, in that you can do the incantation, you can burn the herbs and what have you, but if there is not intention behind it, then it even in modern ceremonial magic and witchcraft, it's not going to work. Their intention has to be tied to what you are doing.
What was it? Voldemort said to Harry Potter about the Cruciatus is like, you've got to mean it. You have to mean it. All right, Austin, do you have that reference? Or
yeah, I think it's in reference to like the animals being in your place, kind of a concept which he also writes out. But I don't know how Kabbalistically we want to get into this.
Much as you want.
Nefesh and Neshama, you have the godly soul, the animal soul, more or less. Topic for another day if you want to dive into it. But
we will.
Ultimately, when you lean on the animal, you're putting your whole nefesh on it. Your essentially the body, the animal soul, is the thing that caused you to sin. It's think like back in the garden, the command was to rule over all the creatures of the dust. You are a creature from the dust. Yep. The thing that's not from the dust is the breath of God. That's the godly soul that is within you. So you're supposed to rule over that. You're supposed to have dominion over that. The issue is that when it flip-flops and the creature of dust actually rules over the godly. And so when you put all of that weight onto the animal, what you're doing is you're putting your nefesh onto the animal, and it's like that soul, the animal soul, is being put onto the animal. The full weight of your body is putting onto that animal. That animal then goes up in smoke. It gets converted into air, breath, and it goes back up to the one who gave it. So in that way, it's a way of the body essentially being the nefesh, the animal soul, being at one with God again and having that renewal. And so it's not to say that you're, I guess, in like a penal substitutionary atonement.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's
kind of a transfer
undertones
of
there. Yeah, right.
You know, it's because this is why it has to be done with the body, right? Because, well, I mean, that, you know, that's where the nefesh manifests itself. Is within the body. The laying on of hands, actually, which is it's interesting that it works in the sacrificial system because it also works in the ordination system, right?
Yeah.
And that's why there has to be weight behind it. And, you know, in the Christian world, we just think of somebody just lightly, you know, touching somebody else. You know, they lay their hands on them. But in a more Semitic sense, that actually there should be weight behind that. You should be putting the weight of your body on whatever it is that you are laying hands on, right? Because it's an investment of your strength, of you, right? Who and what you are onto the goat, the person, you know, that's the way that works.
It also doesn't matter necessarily what animal. It's not a pay to play kind of a sin system. Like, oh, I want to go, you know, have adultery or commit adultery with my neighbor.
So what you're saying
3
is
goats?
it's not expensive, Grace.
Right. It's
well, I can still do it,
but like it works on, like, you can, whether it's a goat or a sheep or you have a dove or you have a sack of flour, there's like different offerings for different things, but it's not a pay to play sin system where, you know, the rich are like, like most people assume speeding tickets are just the cost of speeding if you can afford it. It's not set up in that way. You have to put your full weight, you have to put your essence, your life force behind what you're doing to really recognize it. Because at the end of the day, there's this idea that you are changed on the inside. You're having your body also change. There's a purification and atonement that's happening. And at the end of the day, you are not that person anymore.
So almost like how Paul says, you know, I die daily. Like, you know, we're to be crucified with Christ. Nevertheless, not I, but Christ lives in me. Therefore, the life I now live in the flesh, I live by His strength, not my own. You know, it's that similar concept, I think, of
and you can't pay an animal
dying, but you're slaying your animal nature in that way.
And you can't pay an animal. Like, I can't say, oh, well, it's here, you know, committing this crime is going to cost me 1 goat. I'm rich, I can afford a goat, put my weight on it, whatever. There actually has to be a change of person. The goat is pretty much like, we'll maybe get to that in a little bit, but the goat is actually completely unnecessary in this process if you're actually atoning, because like, it's not necessary. It's not a replacement for you in any way. We can still atone today without having any animal sacrifices. Nothing has changed between the first and second temple period. You could atone without any animal sacrifices.
That's an interesting angle to go on, because I think maybe that drives some of the understanding in some Christian circles about this, where it's like you have to have an animal sacrifice in order to make this work. And Jesus, like, it's essentially, it's kind of like, well, you have to have Jesus or you can't be saved. There's some logic there that I think kind of flows into some of that conversation that it'd be interesting to follow down. I don't know if we have time right now, but yeah, that would be interesting to dig into a little bit.
So I think we want to hit one more model, and then we'll bring up the big conversation point. for Sherman, because I know he's excited about this and he's biting his tongue. So what I call Passover model, I don't know if there's an official name for this. This is something I came across, and I don't want to say I invented. I did not invent this, but when I was starting off in Torah with Tom Bradford, is how he talked about how Yeshua died on Passover. He was buried on the day of unleavened bread, or in preparation for it, and then he rose again on first fruits. And as I studied through the timeline, like, it was eerily insane how the two parallel, the two events, the first Passover and this one. So now, again, this is something I haven't looked too much into the language on, but Tom Bradford points out that it really kind of looks like the days of darkness happened leading up to Passover, right? So if you really play this timeline out, and assuming that that's true, you have Palm Sunday, Yeshua enters Jerusalem. Well, that would have been Nisan 10 when the lamb is picked. Then you have Judas Iscariot. Satan enters Judas Iscariot, and that would happen on the day that darkness fell. And then you have the Last Supper, which happens on the day that the firstborns would have eaten their Last Supper. And then the lamb is slain. Like, I mean, it is just point for point.
Yeah.
There's equivalency to that first Passover. And that's where I really started diving more into this. So I don't know y'all's thoughts. You guys may know more on some of those events than I do, but that's what I call the Passover model. And so he is our Passover lamb. And I believe more that we should look to Passover examples than to Yom Kippur examples for what he did. Now, y'all take over. Have fun. I said my summary.
Well, I would agree. And I think where a lot of, again, PSA misunderstand the Passover model in particular is to mistake the Passover lamb as a sin offering. It's not.
Yeah.
Now,
for sure.
The written Torah does not specify what kind of offering the Passover lamb is. It just gives us various clues by which we can compare it to other offerings to see which it is the most like. So I've heard some people come up with theories that it's a unique offering in and of itself.
No,
it could be, but from what we can derive from rabbinic commentary, it's a peace offering.
Well, and it would be really hard to look at it as a sin offering because the people partake of it.
Right.
And in the Levitical system, they don't partake of those offerings. There are many others they do. That's not one of them. So yeah, there's a lot of those crossing over categories that happens. You get the same kind of thing that happens with saying, oh, well, Yom Kippur is the thing we should be looking at, and Atonement is what we think it is, and therefore we can look at this and see, oh, well, this one goat was had the sins put on it, and then it was killed, and then you're like, hold up, that one wasn't killed. Oh yeah, that's right. Okay, so then the other goat was killed and its blood was used to purify, but that was a pure goat, not one that was like, the logic starts to kind of fall apart the more you try to shove PSA into even Yom Kippur. And I think there are some very good reasons to look at Yom Kippur and see that as essentially with Christ, it's the eschatological day of atonement. It's the atonement for the cosmos. It's a much broader idea. And we see this in 1 John 2:2, where he says, that he's the atonement not only for our sins, but for the whole world. And this is an idea of cleansing for the cosmos that is just, you can't shove it into, he is the wrath of God appeasing sacrifice. Like, you can't shove that in there. It doesn't work.
I think fascinating enough, even if one were to base PSA on the Yom Kippur model, it still falls short in justifying the cheap grace model.
Yeah.
Because in spite of the sacrifice on Yom Kippur, it still required an effort on your part. It still required you to do something, or rather not to do something. It required you to fast, right? To deny the self, to starve the animal soul, right? There's still something on Yom Kippur that's incumbent on you to do in addition to the sacrifice.
Yep.
So that model doesn't really work for the cheap grace that people try and make it work.
Mm-hmm.
All right, Sherman, I'm very proud of you. You have withheld and you've beat around the bush so well. So I'm let it rip. All right.
Oh, yeah. Well, so one more thing, just on the whole thing of Passover, right?
Mhm.
That whole idea is very central to early Christian understanding of what Jesus did.
Yeah.
So Melito of Sardis on Pascha, a very, very interesting read. It's challenging in the sense that there's some ways that he talks about some things in very supersessionist ways, which is super weird and fascinating, and I don't know what to do with it entirely, because he had a Jewish background, as far as we can tell. And so he approaches some of these things in some of those ways, but he really looks at what Jesus did essentially as the new Passover, or as a Passover, as the cosmic Passover. There are different ways to kind of phrase that and understand it, but and the ways that he talks about it, I mean, it's going through. He's basically giving like a Passover Haggadah that is, and then Jesus led us into freedom, and so it's very, very hard for me to look at this anymore from an Eastern Orthodox perspective and separate out what Jesus did from this idea. So I'm very glad that you brought that up, because that is very much a core of how we understand it. It's how we understand Christus Victor. So if you separate out ideas of Passover, and we would talk about the harrowing of Hades and those kinds of things too, which we don't have time to get into. If you separate all of that out from Christus Victor and you think you're talking about Christus Victor, we would say you're probably not talking about Christus Victor. It's bigger than you think. So all of that is kind of in that conversation there too. But one of the things I wanted to talk about with this is usually what we'll have is this idea that atonement, that Tyndale, coined a word for, atonement, and he said, "Oh, this seems to be what's going on." He basically coined a word and then used it to translate a priestly action, and then the term that he used is talking about the result, right? So the priest is going to make atonement, and then this person will be forgiven, or the priest makes atonement, and then the woman that brought had a child is made clean, right? Ritually, considered clean. All of that gets kind of wrapped up into the priest does an action and now there's a result. And if we end up just saying the result is atonement, right? Then we can get confused, and we can literally make atonement a clown car and just shove everything we want into it in terms of the explanations we think for how Jesus accomplished this. And that, I think, is a lot of how you end up with things like penal substitutionary atonement becoming so popular, is that it's not even an atonement theory properly. Most of these aren't actually atonement theories, because they're talking about what Jesus did to save us. They're talking about reconciliation with God, but they're not actually addressing atonement in the original concept. They're not addressing what the priests actually did, right? So if you're not addressing kippur, if you're not addressing, the hilas terms in Greek, you're not really talking about atonement. You're talking about something else, right? And that conflation just allows for so much confusion. And again, you can just, how many clowns do I want to put in here that are all PSA clowns? They can be all PSA clowns. Great. So I think that's a huge part of trying to understand this, is we need to understand what atonement was in the Torah, in the Levitical system, looking at the sacrifices, understand those not just in terms of how we want to read back from how we understand the cross, but also understanding the communal aspects to it, the celebratory aspects to it, the peace offerings, all of these other things. When we look at sacrifice, then we can actually try to understand through those patterns, okay, how does that inform how we understand what Jesus did? And then we can start the circle that goes back and forth and start to see truth there. But if we're only looking backwards and we start in the wrong place, we're just not going to understand what's going on.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm done ranting.
I love it.
I need to let other people talk.
By the way, you have a new fan, so
How would you define, right, to explain for everyone watching, how would you define at-one-ment, right? Flesh that out for us.
So if I were to define the two, right, at-one-ment is basically this idea of, keep ranting, this idea of this is what Jesus did to bring God and humanity back together, right?
Reconciliation with the Father.
Yes, right. Which is weird because the atonement action priests they do on objects. You never have the atonement verb described as a priest atoning God. So I don't know how you're supposed to talk about this in terms of appeasement when you're using those terms when they're never addressed to God. Like it's just it's an odd thing. You do have Moses talking about trying to make atonement when he goes up after the golden calf, but there isn't really like a sense of object there. It's just like, I want to try to make things right. But you get more into what atonement was in the sacrificial system, and you end up getting into discussions of, okay, Kippur terms, are we talking about ransom? Some people think there are notes of that in there. Are we talking about covering, and is that a verb or is that a noun? There people just debate about that kind of stuff. You have ideas about propitiation, and then people will front load their view of propitiation as wrath appeasement, and then read that back into the translation in English that they're reading, when they're actually reading a term that's talking about like either the cover, like the literal ark cover, or that's talking about the place of mercy, essentially, etymologically, or you're talking about expiation. So you're talking about trying to cleanse something, or trying to, the goat carries the sin out of the camp, right? And for me, I look at it in Akkadian terms, same terms, wiping. Well, gee, if wiping is the thing, I wonder what's going on here. That sounds a lot like cleansing, right?
Yeah.
The goat carrying the taint of sin out of the camp. That sounds a lot like, all of these things about the fact that you have atonement made for things that are considered sin and things that are not considered moral, right? Well, those things that are not considered moral, those are uncleanness things. Those are things coming close to death that need to be dealt with in order for God to dwell safely among his people. Again, cleansing seems to be the thing that needs to be done, right? That can please God, so you can have an idea of propitiation in your head if you think about the pleasing aroma of the sacrifices going up to him when you're talking about the olah, right? But to read, that means he must have been mad before, and now he's happy with us because we killed something and tortured it. It's just a complete misread of the entire thing, right? Yeah. So, yeah.
I was going to say, I think there's also this conflation with wrath, forgiveness, and favor, as though they all take place within the same frame, and that's not necessarily the case.
Yeah.
Now this is going to be a crude example that doesn't exactly capture what's going on, but it's one that is relatable, and it's one that's even discussed loosely in.
When you say crude, do I need to get my mute button ready?
No, not that. Just just very basic. But it's loosely discussed in Tanya, which is the idea they bring to bear that repentance is what begets forgiveness, right? That the sacrificial system really is entirely unnecessary for the forgiveness aspect, right? But they relate it to a king pardoning someone for having a contrite heart, right? For repenting. So the king has pardoned you. That doesn't exactly mean that he's happy with you at this point. So you've bypassed the punishment because of repentance, but the gifts that you would offer the king to garner back favor that would correlate a little more so to the sacrificial system.
Yeah. I tend to look at it as sacrifices being gifts that are brought to God with the ideal of it being a reciprocal process of like trying to outdo each other in gift giving, even though we know we can't outgive God because he gives us everything anyways. But then it's in essence, it's like, I want to begin a proper relationship. I want to deepen this relationship. I want to repair this relationship, right? So the evangelicals aren't wrong when they say it's all about relationship. They just tend to want to say that it's that and nothing else. And sometimes that gets a little bit too granular.
It's like the scene in The Office where Andy and Dwight are trying to outdo each other.
Yeah.
Out-gentleman each other.
One thing about the at one man in particular, because that model is something, the idea of reconciliation with the Father is something that we see in one of the messianic models in the Torah. Right. But it's often missed. And that's in the story of Joseph.
Oh, yeah.
The story of Joseph, everybody just assumes. And this actually can also play a little bit into the Jewish understanding that, atonement for Jews versus Gentiles may function just a little bit differently. For the sake of the fact that, the Jews had a covenant with God and Gentiles do not. We can get into Romans 11 and whatnot and how that works, but
sure.
But the idea that people get is that Jacob and his sons were also suffering from the famine at this point, and that's actually not necessarily supported by the scriptures. What we see is Jacob coming to his sons and saying, "Why are you being so conspicuous?" Well, what does he mean by that? What's he saying? Now, rabbinic commentaries would suggest that they actually were relatively unaffected by the famine that was happening at the time, and that his sons were more or less flaunting how okay they were, more or less, which in terms of how God's covenants work, that makes sense. God made a covenant with Jacob. They were going to be okay regardless, because God made a covenant with them promising they would be okay.
Yeah.
Right. So the function of Joseph is not necessarily in saving his brothers from starvation due to the famine. What he helped to obtain for the brothers was reconciliation with their father. You get this idea throughout the narrative, especially when it comes to the subject of Joseph requiring Benjamin to show up, that Jacob doesn't really trust these boys with Benjamin. He still suspects something that they had to do with Joseph's disappearance. At the very least, some level of neglect that caused him to turn up missing. But there's a level of suspicion that is inherent in his words to them. And that's the one thing that Joseph asks his brothers: is your father okay? He seeks to know the state of his father first. And we don't really ever see, now I think it can be implied that he did forgive his brothers, but we don't really see that fleshed out in words. What we do see is a reconciliation of his brothers with their father. That's the function that he served.
So there's also a really interesting moment there when they come back together, and you have, like, he is so stunned, it's as if he's dead, is kind of how it's described. And then you have him essentially kind of coming back to life with the realization that his son has returned to him. And to me, it's really interesting to look at that, especially because I believe they refer to him as Israel in that case, don't they? So you have this idea almost of like Israel resurrecting in the presence of the son that has returned, the resurrected son, essentially. Yeah. So there is a whole parallel of Joseph with Christ that was employed pretty heavily by some in the early church that mostly gets missed now.
Yes.
I feel like in Christian circles, because it's not convenient for something like PSA. Did I say that out loud? Yeah, I did say that out loud.
Also with Atonement, something that, yes, less important, but should be noted is that the reconciliation has to happen on the terms of the one who's transgressed, not on the terms of the transgressor.
Yeah.
So, there's because I've seen a few different things where it's like, oh, you do it however you want, modern day or whatever. But I think that having atonement just on a personal level, repentance and everything else, it has to be done on the terms of the ones that you transgressed, not based on what you think is good enough. And so even with whether it's Jesus and the atonement model there, or if it's in personal lives, like say you wronged a friend or a colleague, you still need to recognize that reconciliation, that atonement between brothers before you go to the altar, before you go to prayer, that has to be done on their terms, that you meet them.
Yep. Which interestingly plays into the Joseph story very quickly. Just that we don't ever see Joseph having a conversation with Jacob saying, yeah, this is what they did to me. It's never brought up. Now, we don't know that it wasn't, but it's another interesting change and shift in the person of Joseph that we see, whereas earlier on, we see that he would constantly bring his father bad reports about his brothers. He was a little bit of a tattletale, but here at the ultimate reconciliation, we don't see him ever bringing that up, right? We don't see that he goes to his father and levies an accusation against his brothers, or what we would say is just an explanation of how these things transpired. Anything can be inferred there for sure. Maybe he did, maybe his brothers did, maybe they came clean and were like, hey, Dad, this this is how this all came to be. This is how Joseph ended up in Egypt. But I think the change in Joseph, the change in the fact that he's not bringing this bad report to his father is noteworthy.
Since it started with a bad report.
Yeah.
So, one more thing, and then I have 2 starred questions, and we need to move semi quickly because we do have the after parties to get to. Austin, did I see you grab your whiteboard?
I did. I was working on something, and then I was like, "Oh, maybe it's too much." But yeah, I have something doodled.
Let's do it. This will make a good TikTok cut.
All right. Here we go. Just because we were talking about the Jesus being like this Passover lamb, kind of a concept, a peace offering, and while it's not exactly a 1-to-1, I think there's typologies within the Passover sacrifice specifically. So this is a short little doodle here.
Nice.
Brad might be a little bit familiar with it, but ultimately you have, so in the beginning, in Egypt, so we're talking about the first Passover, you have everyone that's supposed to be kept inside their home, right, within Egypt, and they have to have a animal sacrifice. The blood has to be put on the doorway, so you have this bloody doorway concept, and they have to be ready to burst forth at any moment, right? You have to be ready to go. They're waiting all night. Doesn't even happen until first light. But then they come out to the water breaks, and then they have to travel through the Red Canal or the Red Sea, but it's been split. So there's this Red Canal that has gone through, and ultimately there's this ending here where they're brought up to Mount Sinai to see the face of the Father, right? It's a birth narrative that's actually happening. So it's from the concept of Jesus being this Passover lamb, it's almost as if he is starting. He hasn't gone through this part yet. This is where we're going through. And that's a whole other discussion, but he's created the bloody doorway. He's made it accessible to go through that doorway in order to go see the Father face to face. Right. So we're in this journey of birth pains, essentially, before we can go up. That's the short version of it, but there's a lot more parallels.
That is so cool because is it Hebrews, I think, that says that all of creation groans as a woman in labor?
Yes.
Yeah, and there's also like the idea that you have the animal that is in this womb that ends up being consumed and eaten by all of its inhabitants, and they take that life force with them out, and every part of that animal becomes part of who they are.
It's really interesting to then think about that in new Passover terms in my head, right? Because that's where we end up going a lot. If you go to the morning service on Saturday, the day before what we would call Easter or Pascha, in the Eastern Orthodox Church, we have just a ton of Old Testament readings that are all about looking forward to resurrection, right? Looking forward to Christ's resurrection and what that means for us. And then you get into the evening service is basically starts at 11:30 at night, and it's a vigil for, as we understand it, Pascha, for this Passover experience we have that's understood to be like the cosmic version of this. And that chart that you wrote can very easily be mapped in very similar ways onto Hades or Sheol. And that you have the people that are in darkness and they're in chains and they're awaiting this new birth, right? And the fact that the way Paul talks about in 1 Corinthians 15, the body has to be buried and then it can be raised up a new thing. And so we in essence have this idea of this pattern over and over and over in Scripture of God being the one who can bring life through the midst of death.
Yeah.
You'll see it again with even the symbolism of 400 years in Egypt, 40 representing the 40 weeks of the womb, the mem representing the womb, the waters, pregnancy. You have 40 years in the wilderness. The whole wilderness is another birth story. It's just this birth cycle over and over. It's with every new rebirth that we have, which if you look at baptism or repentance as being a whole new rebirth. With every rebirth, you're actually becoming closer and closer to being able to see God. But it's not just done in the first one. Like, you get to see it to some degree, but the full revealing doesn't happen until the very end, and we're continually being rebirthed throughout our lives.
Wow. That's great.
Awesome.
It's interesting a way that kind of ties in just loosely to that analogy that you drew out, because if this is a birth and the idea is the birth canal, then the woman giving birth in this case would be Egypt, more or less. And it's something that we see throughout Genesis and then culminating in Exodus, is encounters of the people that God has made a covenant with Egypt. It's a repetitive cycle. And it almost seems as though God in his grander scheme has always planned to have a redemption plan in set for Egypt through Israel, right? Through the mode and function of Israel in his grander scheme. And as we know, Egypt, especially in rabbinic writings, is euphemistic for the totality of the nations, for the entire Gentile world. That parallel follows through into what we read in the New Testament about the including of Gentiles. You know, there's our Romans 11 reference.
Yep.
And I don't think that can be separated from the analogy. You know, for the analogy to be complete, that has to be true.
It's like a different dimension too, because Egypt often is connected into the idea of death or Sheol, or like going down to Egypt, right?
Yeah.
Coming back up to Jerusalem as going uphill, you know? Joseph has the same kind of experience. He goes down into the pit. He goes down into Egypt. He goes down, and he goes down, and then he's raised up. And so there are multiple dimensions to that are very, very interesting.
Yep. It's actually, there's a Rabbi Foreman from Aleph Beta has an entire section of his teachings called "The Exodus That You Almost Passed Over." He's got a book on it too, where he essentially relates the Exodus story to the funeral procession of Jacob, aka Israel, right? And because there are several thematic references that are consistent throughout both narratives, you know, and the difference being the heart of Egypt, right? The heart of Egypt was fully invested in heralding Jacob out of Egypt, you know, in releasing Israel from Egypt. You know, they were part of that, and they were totally invested. Whereas in the Exodus narrative, we have a different Pharaoh who is much more opposed to God. And so that's where the struggle ensues, right? What God's plan was, what he wanted was for Pharaoh to have a contrite heart, to mirror the Pharaoh of the funeral procession of Jacob, right? And willingly release his children. But Pharaoh wouldn't do that. And so the hard times ensued.
I mean, so you want to get into some really interesting parallels with that too. You start getting into Romans 9 in the way that Paul talks about the hardening of Pharaoh. The way that he talks about that, to me, the best parallel I can look at is that he is talking about the hardening of some people from among Israel against the Messiah, and that being instrumental in bringing about the freedom of the nations from the gods of the nations. And so there's a parallel of him defeating the gods of Egypt and now defeating all of the gods. And you could kind of look at that and say, is there a sense in which, you know, the gods of the nations actually having some reality to them, right? Not as gods in the way we think of God, but having some reality to them. Jubilees looks at it and basically says, you know, the nations were allotted over to angels to lead them astray. You have other ideas where, you know, Paul talks about God dividing the nations, and he did this so that they would seek him. And you almost have this idea of like, were they supposed to lead people back to Yahweh? And yet they didn't, just like Pharaoh didn't.
Right.
Right. So there's a whole bunch of layers to that too that gets super fascinating.
All right. Well, we are at an hour and 11 minutes. We did have 2 questions, so I want to see if we can get some just very, very brief answers. All right. First, from Ronan Torah, is it strange to think that Yeshua died on behalf of high-handed sins and the Levitical system handles unintentional sins? I think that's probably more directed at our president and producer. You guys would have a little bit more probably on that.
It's not strange to think. This idea is actually spoken about in Hebrews, even, where the author says that for such sins there are no sacrifices, and there aren't. If you committed one of those sins, you were either exiled from the camp or executed. Which, to be exiled from the camp was essentially a death sentence in and of itself. But those were the 2 options that you got. So there wasn't a sacrifice for something that would, as you said, high-handed. And I don't think it's a mistake to maybe submit that the sacrifice of Yeshua does still make atonement for those, at least within the proper frame of how we're understanding atonement.
It's also interesting to look at someone like David, because he should have been exiled or killed.
Yep.
Yet he wasn't. So how does that inform how we understand what it means to keep the Torah and what it means to repent and how all of this ties together? We don't have time to really discuss that, but it is interesting to,
Yeah.
All right. And then last question then.
Tagging onto that real quick, just the national, I think Aaron put it in here, but the national includes the individual. You have to have repentance to, like, personally for any of it to actually hold any weight. So high priest can be offering whatever he wants, but if you personally don't atone or personally don't repent, it doesn't do anything.
All right. Is Judges 13 a typology for the Messiah when the angel of Hashem steps into the offering and ascends to heaven?
That's rad.
I would need to really probably think and examine that, but I mean, my first inclination is that it could certainly act as a typological symbology, the same way as Abraham separating the animals into the parts and the torch being the one that walks through them. Of course, there's more complexity to that would need to be gone into also. But I don't think that's a mistake at all. I do think that probably for a better understanding, that's something we could do another whole one of these discussions on.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I'm trying to recall specifically whether you see that addressed in the Church Fathers, but generally speaking, when you see the angel of the Lord, they're usually talking about that as if it is Christ. And the idea of him being essentially an ascension offering or a first fruits offering makes a ton of sense. So.
All right. Well, gentlemen, thank you so much for contributing tonight and being a part of this. Austin, thank you for filling in for Will. We will roast him next time we can get him on. And everybody in the audience, thank you so much for your participation. This has been fun. If you're an Alternate Media subscriber, we're going to jump into the after parties and have some fun there. Or I hope it's fun. Brad always says we can sit in awkward silence. So we'll see what happens with that.
Or roast me, because, again, very few have ever taken up on the Seamus has been roasted, but I've not been. So,
Yep. Maybe we'll get what's his name from the British comedian who does the crowd roasting.
Jimmy Carr.
Jimmy Carr, yes. We'll get Jimmy Carr in there and be like, just go to town.
And Joshua, tell everybody where they can find you and your content.
Oh, goodness. So I have a podcast called Tending Our Nets that is focused on the gospel. I did about a season of that about 3 years ago. So that's still up. I do have plans for a new season of that. I'm still working on it. And then I also do a lot of work with Faith Unaltered and Genesis Marks a Spot and When Deep Calls Deep Amber.
Awesome. And also, if you're on Facebook, Joshua is one of the administrators. Is that the right word?
Yeah.
For the Michael Heiser's Unseen
Divine
Realm
Council
group,
Worldview
Divine
group,
Council
yeah.
Worldview group.
Yep.
And so you'll see him quite a bit there. You've done interviews with Will, I think. So yeah.
Yeah, I actually just did one recently. It was more of a discussion with Father Tom Soroka on Ancient Faith Live on Ancient Faith last week, and that was very last minute. So that was a surprise. But yeah, so a lot of different places. Makes it a little fun to try to find me, but you know.
Yep. You can
I
check
don't
out
care.
Renovating Faith and our first Biblical Lens conversation that we had. That was a lot of fun, which has obviously sparked this show. And so we're obviously hoping to have Joshua back anytime that he's available. We try to do this broadcast now every third Sunday of the month. And Will and Joshua have agreed to be here when they can. They also have, very busy lives and ministries and things they're doing. But so I'm very thankful for him making himself available. When we said we were going to do Atonement, he said, make it a day I can be available. So he was very excited about this topic. So again, thank you to all of our supporters. Thank you, Joshua, Brad, Austin. This has been fun. I've enjoyed it. And if you are going to jump in the after part, now is the time.